Would you please pray with me? Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us this morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing unto you. Amen. So I've told you before that I was not always certain that working in a church was for me. And in fact, pretty certain that it wasn't. But looking back, I've pretty much worked in the church my whole life. Even when I was still a youth, I gave up a month every so often to help in children's church. And I started counseling church camps when I was 15 years old. And as soon as I was done with high school, I was working with the JYFers, the 4th and 5th graders, as a sponsor. And then the Cairo kids. And then before I was done with college, I was working with high school kids. I've done more things with youth in my life than I could possibly recount. I've done more youth group days, more youth Sundays. I tried to talk Samantha into making today a youth Sunday so I could sleep in, but she wasn't going for it. I've done more church camps. I literally could not count how many weeks of my life in the summer were spent at camp. But one of my favorite things to do working with youth was always mission trips. I can remember vividly every single mission trip that I either went on as a youth or went on as an adult with youths. Mission trips are powerful trips. Often they can bring about a transformative experience for those that attend them. A few mission trips that stand out in my mind, I talked about one not that long ago where we went to the Arizona desert. We took the youth of our church and 2 other churches, there were 3 churches together, where we went to the Arizona desert and worked with Humane Borders, which was started by a disciples minister. It was making sure that there was water in the desert, water stations, for the people that were crossing the border in the 115-degree heat, to make sure that they wouldn't die in the desert. Because hundreds of people every year do die in the deserts as they try to make a better life for themselves and their family. That was a powerful trip. Of course, one of the best parts I remember is going and visiting Tombstone. I remember a trip that I helped plan that we had about 5 churches go on this trip. We went to Washington, D.C. And we spent from about 9 in the morning till 2 or 3 in the afternoon working at various sites throughout the metro D.C. area, and then spent from about 4 to 9 at night seeing all of the things to see in Washington, D.C. And it was a crazy trip to plan because we had sites all over the place. We broke the groups into small groups to work at the various sites. And so there was a lot of bus and subway and that sort of thing involved. And when you've got like 12 kids that you're trying to make sure to get on the subway bus, let me tell you, I don't know how anyone could have done this trip before cell phones. Because there was one moment when somebody didn't make it onto the subway. One of the youth. And so the next stop, one of the adults got off and waited to see if that person would be on the train at the next stop. And if we hadn't had cell phones, it would have made that a lot more scarier. So that's one of the things that these modern technologies have made a little easier. And I remember another trip where we took the middle schoolers to Athens, Texas, the church camp that we have in Texas, and specifically what we call the creative side. Some people refer to it as the undeveloped side because it's the side that doesn't have the big cabins and the air conditioning. It's a much more rustic camp. But we were putting in some new facilities and really working on beautifying that area, and that was the camp that the middle schoolers went to. So it was their camp. And I remember this trip particularly because the Western Conference Finals, where the Chicago Blackhawks had just swept the San Jose Sharks, had just happened. So I had my playoff beard, my full NHL playoff beard, that was 3 months in at this point. And it was about 107, and I was out pouring concrete with the sun beating down. And I was like, maybe it wouldn't have been the worst thing if we didn't move on to the Stanley Cup Finals this year. Of course, we ended up winning the Stanley Cup. It turned out worth it in the end. But a recent mission trip I took, I think the last mission trip that I did, it was with my youth at Richland Hills, and I kind of was not intending to be the youth minister there, and I kind of found myself as the youth minister right before summer, and the mission trip was already planned, and it was with about 100 churches. And there were nearly, I think, 600 or 700 kids on this trip, and it was kind of insane. We went to Northwest Arkansas, and we're working in and around Northwest Arkansas with one day some of the group going to Joplin, Missouri. And this was exactly 1 year after that huge tornado went through Joplin, Missouri. So I think most of us were prepared to work very hard, especially in that day that we went to Joplin, because there was a lot of work to be done in Joplin. Maybe in rebuilding, maybe in helping clear out some of the rubble that was still present a year later. But that isn't the work that we were given to do that day in Joplin. Since our group was so big, even though only about half the kids went up to Joplin, since our group was so large and was made up of both middle schoolers and high schoolers, we're perhaps limited in the work that they could give us to do. Now, Joplin lost a lot of trees in that tornado. In fact, almost all of the trees in the city were destroyed in that tornado. And so they have been replanting thousands of trees in order to regain something that they had lost. And recently, it had been very dry. And all of the water trucks were out of service. So they said, well, we've got lots of kids. Let's send them out with water to water trees. So we were sent to a cemetery in the city to water trees. Now, it wasn't quite what we had envisioned our day would be, but we went to work anyway, determined to our best, and we started watering each of these new trees as the skies opened up and began to rain.
Oh my goodness.
Now, watering trees in the rain certainly wasn't what many of us figured that we might be doing when we left early in the morning for Joplin on that day. And in those circumstances, a transforming experience might not be the easiest to come by. I honestly have never heard as much grumbling and complaining as I heard. And working with youth for a long time, I've heard a lot of grumbling and complaining, but probably never as much as I heard in that morning. But that's why I really love the story of the Transfiguration, because I think it shows us that having a transforming experience maybe isn't as easy as we think it should be. You see, the disciples that Jesus brought along with him to pray on that mountain, they saw something incredible. They witnessed a vision that was indescribable and amazing. They saw visual proof of the divinity of Christ. They heard verbal affirmation of Jesus' identity. And that only happens twice in the Gospel of Mark. Those of us who've been studying through Mark recognize that. And the other time is at Jesus' baptism, and no one else but Jesus hears it. So it's a little different here because the verbal affirmation has others there to hear it this time. And they saw God's plan throughout the ages personified in front of them. They saw the law in the form of Moses. They saw the prophets in the form of Elijah. And they saw the covenant of grace in the form of Jesus Christ. They saw a foreshadowing of the work that Jesus still had to do. Work that would include death and resurrection. There are a couple things that I think it is necessary for us to recognize. Like I said, the law and the prophets are represented through Moses and Elijah. And Jesus is among them. So Jesus is a continuation of the salvific history of God's actions in the world. Now, what's really interesting is first century Jews, now many of us are aware of the idea that Elijah never died, that Elijah was brought up the chariot of fire and brought up into heaven without ever actually having died. First century Jews actually had the same belief about Moses. It was not a common understanding at the time that Moses died, which now is for many of us, as we have Moses' death, which interestingly is also supposedly written by Moses. But they had this vision of Moses also having been brought up into heaven without actually ever having died before they got to the promised land. And so you have Moses, who was lifted into heaven without death, and Elijah, who was lifted into heaven without death, and Jesus, who should have been lifted into heaven without death. And that's what Peter sort of advocates for. Let's just set up camp right here. We'll stay here. Nothing bad will ever happen again. You're shiny. You're happy. We've got Moses and Elijah. That's pretty cool. Why would we ever leave? Peter, as he is often wont to do throughout the Gospels, and especially in Mark, completely misunderstands the importance of what he just witnessed. But trying to stick in the moment, especially a transformative moment, the mountaintop experience, if you will, trying to stay is never what a transformative encounter calls us to do. When we're fundamentally changed, we have to go out and respond to that change. We can't stay where we were before the change occurred. But the disciples kind of do stay where they were. Even as they travel down from the mountaintop with the transformed Jesus, they still fail to understand what's actually occurring. Peter, just a few verses later, or chapters later, will still go on to deny Jesus. And the others are still convinced that they're preparing for the coming of an earthly kingdom, a restoration of the kingdom of Israel. They don't understand Jesus' ministry. Hence why we have yet again an example of the messianic secret in Mark where Jesus tells them, you can't talk about this until after my death and resurrection. Because if you're just focused on the glory, you're missing the point. So even after that mountaintop experience, the disciples still aren't prepared for where they're headed next. Mountaintop experiences, mission trip experiences, worship experiences, none of them matter if they don't transform us. We can't just find something pleasant, something pleasing, and put up walls to try and stay there forever. We can't just say, let's celebrate shiny, happy Jesus holding hands. Let's sway back and forth and stay rooted to this wonderful spot on the mountaintop. Nope. It doesn't work that way. The ways of the world, the earthly kingdoms, the pleasures that we seek for ourselves, money, power, prestige. These are not part of God's plan for us. A salvific plan laid out for us by the laws and by the prophets and by the grace and love of Jesus Christ, who was part of God's divinity, chosen to live forever away from the trouble and drama and despair of the world, yet who chose to come back down from the mountaintop and experience the horror, the pain, the worst of what humanity has to offer. Death, crucifixion, torture, and suffering of the cross. And I think a lot of times we miss how horrible that cross really is because we have nice, clean images of the cross in our churches and around our necks. That was a horrible way to die. It was the complete opposite of the shiny, happy moment that we see in our scripture today. But Jesus chose to come back down the mountain, refused to allow Peter to halt the momentum of what Jesus was doing. Out of grace, out of forgiveness, out of a love that should transform us, that should make it impossible to want to stay in the same place, Jesus was transfigured and revealed and showed us how to react to our own mountaintop experiences. Even though we're often like the disciples, slow to change, slow to be ready to move. And real transformation is hard, and maybe it takes more than just one amazing mountaintop moment. In Joplin on that mission trip, as we drove to the cemetery to water trees that were about to receive water from the sky, we went down the same street that the tornado had plowed through 1 year earlier. One side of the street had made a lot of recovery. There were new buildings, new businesses, homes were springing up, new trees. The other side of the street, however, served as a stark reminder of the devastation that at the time was only 1 year old. And it was on that drive that we saw the spot that used to hold the high school. The entirety of that lot, only one thing remained. It was the sign of Joplin High School. But only two letters remained on the sign. The O and the P of Joplin. Someone had painted a new name for the school on that sign. Hope High School. We also saw the remains of the hospital that was completely destroyed by the tornado. Only part of a parking garage remained. You know, we might not have had the mountaintop experience we expected when we left for this trip, but we saw these things, and we were affected. Like the disciples, maybe we required more before we fully understood. That night, when we were back in northwest Arkansas, we heard from a couple who had survived the tornado. Their story was a powerful one. They went into their bathroom and laid down on the floor with a mattress on top of them as the entire apartment around them was destroyed. The walls of the bathroom collapsed in and almost made another protective barrier over their mattress. That bathroom was the only room left after the tornado passed. And they spoke of others that emerged from the rubble, the incredible destruction that they had witnessed, how that experience had transformed them. Now, we only heard about the experience. We didn't have the mountaintop experience that they had had. So we might not find ourselves markedly different from how we were before hearing of this experience, but we heard it, and we were affected. The disciples weren't changed by their mountaintop experience. Afterwards, they continued on as they had before. They didn't still understand exactly what they were a part of. But ultimately, they did understand. Ultimately, they were changed. And all of those moments they had along the way, where they didn't have the full mountaintop experience, well, those moments weren't wasted ones. Because they did witness. And while they didn't understand, they were affected. And they were out affecting others as well. Even as the disciples did not understand, they did do good work alongside Jesus. They helped others to have their mountaintop experiences. Others recognized Jesus. Others understood the mission more than the disciples did. But it was partly through the actions of the disciples and work of the disciples that others came to understand. The couple who shared their story with us also talked about the importance of all those who had come to Joplin. All those who had come to give of their time and to help work in recovery. Seeing others willing to do anything, even water trees while it rains, showed the people of Joplin that they were not alone in their tragedy. There are others who care. There is, as the sign of the high school proclaims, hope. And that's something that can transform. People witnessed our willingness to work, our bleary-eyed but present participation in the recovery that was still ongoing. And that made a difference. Probably a greater difference than watering trees in the rain. We helped transform others simply by our willingness to work, even if we didn't fully understand why we were doing what we were doing. We helped others to transform, and that's important. Because we know transformation is not always easy. So we have to continue to move forward. We can't stop and put up walls around where we are. We can't just focus on a happy, shiny Jesus and miss the whole point of the gospel. We keep going on, even when we might not fully understand why we're doing what we're doing or how we're supposed to do it. Because that's what we're called to do. Serve as an example for others, helping the transformation of others, struggling towards the time when we do fully understand it all ourselves. When the kingdom of heaven arrives fully here on earth.